All right, let's look at cottage participants' goals for a second, because one of the first questions that I ask, and I think one thing that everybody that is looking at transitioning ownership should consider is, what are the goals? What are my goals as a parent, as a founder, and what are my children's and grandchildren's goals as heirs? And if we look at the founders for a second, realistically, most of the families that come to me have a few goals that are identified here. First being, keep the property in the family for generations so that it can serve as a gathering place for the extended family. Another goal that is often expressed to me is to give children equal shares of the cottage, but avoid trapping an inheritance in the cottage if somebody wants out. And what a lot of these parents are concerned about is they may already know that one or more of their children are not necessarily committed to staying connected to the property, and how do we deal with that when it comes time for mom and dad to write their will or their trust and they're making distribution of their assets. They have to consider who's getting what, and instead of just making a blind gift of whatever's left goes to my children in equal amounts, it may make some sense to divide those assets differently if you know that some of the kids are not going to be as interested in staying connected to the property as the others are. Another set of goals is to keep the interest in the cottage out of the hands of the in-laws and the creditors. And if you, I am the dreaded in-law. I have to raise my hand and confess here. I am the dreaded in-law in my wife's family vacation property, which is where we spend our time. It's where our kids grew up and where our grandchildren now are being raised. And I am the one that wrote the cottage plan that says I will never be an owner of that property. And the reason that I wrote that is because I feel so strongly that where you are trying to keep property in the family for multiple generations, you need to define ownership in terms of the lineal descendants of the founders as opposed to the in-laws. So that question comes up very, very frequently when it is the founders that come to me asking for help in writing a cottage plan. And finally, interestingly, the founders oftentimes have a goal of making sure that the kids understand that the interest of the parents is one of looking at the family as an entire unit. And this is probably where the goals of the founders and the goals of the heirs are completely divergent. Because as I talk to the heirs, it is fairly common for them to be much more focused on what does the cottage represent for me and my wife and my children. Whereas parents are looking at it, and particularly the moms in the audience, are going to look at it from the standpoint of how do we keep everybody happy. And that can be a big challenge. But the idea is that mom and dad now have an opportunity to write a plan that will reinforce the fact that none of the kids is to be favored over any of the others. We're looking at the next generation and generations after that as a single group. But if we look at the heirs, they have very different goals. And very oftentimes they're not necessarily inconsistent with the founders' goals, but they're very different goals. And so if mom and dad come to me, oftentimes they'll say, well, I want my kids to participate in writing this plan because they're the ones that are going to have to live with it. And what I would tell mom and dad that come to me with that position is that you have a golden opportunity to save your kids untold amounts of angst and anxiety and potential conflict. And it's fine for you to include the children in terms of information of what you are doing. I do encourage that. I also encourage the parents to talk to their kids and ask them flat out, are you interested in having an ownership stake in this property when dad and I are gone, or when mom and I are gone? Because it will come as a surprise, I think, to some family members that the kids, for very legitimate reasons, may not have an interest in maintaining the financial commitment that is required when mom and dad are no longer writing the checks. So the heirs' goals and the parents' goals are sufficiently different that I would tell parents, you should communicate with your children, but don't give them the veto power over what goes into the plan, because they're looking at the property very differently than you are. Here are some fairly common heirs' goals, for example. They want to protect the cottage from a divorce, whether it's their own divorce or one of their siblings. One of the primary concerns that the heirs are going to have is, how do we keep the family property out of the hands of the divorce judgment? They want to develop a decision-making structure and control mechanisms. Again, any family that has more than 2 or 3 children in the next generation oftentimes has an alpha male or alpha female. And whether parents recognize and plan for that, the reality is for the heirs, there oftentimes is a family dynamic at work that makes it more likely that one person or 1 or 2 of the children are going to have more assertive personalities and not run roughshod over the others, but tend to control the decision-making process, sometimes for their own benefit, sometimes they believe it's in the best interest of the other children or their siblings, but the heirs are oftentimes interested in creating some kind of control mechanism that will minimize the amount of control that is exercised by fewer than all of the kids. They want to develop consequences for failure to abide by the rules, both financial and behavioral. And again, when mom and dad are no longer writing the checks and the kids have to share all of the costs in some manner, one of the real concerns is what happens if one of my siblings doesn't pay his or her fair share when it's supposed to be paid. Another goal is to develop a fair and flexible scheduling system. Again, this varies in significance depending on how many children there are at the next generation and how much space the property has. And finally, many heirs have an interest in some kind of mechanism to sell their interest back to the family if they decide for whatever reason later on that they no longer want to be connected with it. And when I say connected with it, it isn't because they're mad and they're storming off because they're disappointed in something. It's because for some legitimate reasons. Take my case, for example. My family had vacation property, and my wife's family had vacation property, and we were not going to spend our time between the 2 places. We had to pick one or the other. And as it turned out, my mother was forced out by the dreaded older alpha male brother, and we really didn't have a choice. But there is a strong interest in having some way of exiting the cottage ownership in the event that somebody, for legitimate reasons, decides that they no longer want to be connected with it. Okay, so what are some of the obstacles to meeting those goals? Well, the real estate law that we have in Michigan is, as it is throughout the United States, derived from the English common law, which really put a primary emphasis on the rights of a single owner of a piece of real estate. So it's designed for single person ownership. And when you get to shared ownership of property, all kinds of complications arise that the law simply doesn't have a good way of minimizing the conflict, or it doesn't have a good way of recognizing the interest of multiple owners. The inability of some owners to afford the cottage is a huge issue, and in Michigan that's become much more acute in the last few years as our economy has sort of spiraled into a depression. But the issue of unequal financial resources at the next generation is a huge issue for a lot. Family dynamics, conflict among the owners, is another obstacle to a smooth operation of shared ownership of property. Whether it's the case of somebody saying, that guy stole my bike when I was 12 and I'm going to get back at him one way or another. Every family that I work with, sooner or later, fesses up to the fact that not everything is running as smoothly as they would like at the next generation. And so don't be surprised if there are family dynamics that get in the way of smooth operation